Having seen the citizens' jury process and having seen everyone here today complete the surveys and go through deliberation, what added information do you think that the deliberation brings to surveys and vice versa?
I think it brings a number of aspects to play. One issue about the way we've run the surveys here, and it doesn't have to be done this way, but it's the usual way, is it's very individual response based. The advantage of a deliberative process is you're talking about collectives, you're talking about groups getting together to talk about these issues, and that brings with it a dynamism which leads to development of thought. It's the same with the focus group, for example. It's not just one opinion, a combination of several opinions being added together. This is a dynamic process. So the actual opinions are developing and transforming during the deliberative process. And I think that can lead to a very different outcome. One of the things I think we've seen is, if you ask people individually about what they think, there has been a transformation, okay, not dramatic, but there's been a shift in the way people are thinking about this, which I think is partly about this information deliberative process which is occurring. If you'd asked people at the beginning to fill in a questionnaire and then talked about something else and fill in the questionnaire again, they're probably just trying to repeat what they said the first time because they haven't been influenced really by any other thought. So I think the two rub off each other in a productive way.
I think it's really fascinating to see the internal reflection process that people are going through when they are encouraged to really take on board these different points of view. And I wonder, now I can understand how that might lead to problems when trying to generalise the results following deliberation, how applicable those are to members of the community. And I think that's quite important to bring up, because if we're trying to use citizens' juries or surveys as a means of ensuring that policy is in line with what people want, is what you're suggesting following deliberation, following this self-reflective process, is that different from what you might have answered at the start and therefore what the wider public might think?
Okay,
do you think
can I put a different argument though?
Absolutely.
We can argue that the deliberative process is an ideal form, but it's a very few people involved. If you were a Scottish Government policy maker, how confident would you feel with only having that data? And would you actually say, no, I need the survey data as well because I can canvass a wider opinion about these issues?
So as a Scottish Government official, would I want to have a survey of the people of Scotland that's also informed by this citizen jury process? I'd hope so. I'd hope I would want that. That's how I think in our view, from the citizens jury results should feed into policy making alongside other methods. It shouldn't be a replacement of it. And there are different ways in which that process of being fed in could be. Having these two different information sources would be really valuable. But what's also valuable is having the survey throughout the jury process. We're talking about this as a citizens jury research project, but actually it was a questionnaire project, it was a survey project, it was an ethnography project. There were many different methods involved through the citizen jury. So we were able to analyse how people's opinions changed after the information phase, after the deliberation phase, and that's really interesting from a research point of view. Does information change people's minds, or is it sharing information and reflecting on that information that changes people's minds?
There is obviously a consequence or a cost to bringing in several methods. Inevitably, what you have to think about if you're a research team is you have to have the skills to do these different kinds of methods, to bring them together, and also to analyse them alongside each other. Because mixed methods isn't simply about, oh, here's a qualitative bit of work and here's a quantitative bit of work. It's actually about how you integrate. Now, you can integrate at various stages. You don't have to integrate at the beginning. Some people do, and think about how questions work with the deliberative process alongside it. Others say, no, we'll create those data sets separately, and then through the analytical process, try and integrate them. Or they might leave it till post-analysis, when you're trying to say, okay, what are the outcomes or results, and how do we bring those together, perhaps in a policy framework? So you have to be very clear about when these things come together, but design it from the beginning so that they do work together. But it does raise challenges. You know, we've heard already about the problems of ontological and epistemological approaches perhaps being different. Does that matter? Purists would say very much so. You can't do this. Pragmatists like me would say Well, you can, but you have to be very careful and be aware of these different provenances, if you like, to the data forms you've got.
You've got to be extremely aware throughout the data collection and processing that these uncertainties or biases don't creep in. And certainly in the data analysis for this project, by having survey information and by having the principles, we actually analysed them separately. We had a quantitative specialist looking at the panel analysis of the surveys and the statistical meaning within that, and which is a very interesting point to pick up on in a second. Meanwhile, there's qualitative analysis of the principles going on, and we didn't want the analysis of the principles to be affected by the knowledge of what was coming out of the surveys, because the risk is that even as a researcher, your views will be biased by what you know about what the juries think. So we had a process in place from the very beginning about how that data would be analysed and the different lenses would be looking through. So bringing together that information, two separate analyses, or I say two, I'm simplifying, there were many different approaches that were brought together. You then had to look at each data set through the lens of the other data set to ensure that there was no huge uncertainties and biases coming into play. And I think that's a real risk and something to be very aware of in the research data design.
Yes, although there's an interesting question there, and some people might like to reflect on this, is should the results of the first questionnaire influence how people think in the next phase? I think inevitably everyone here who has filled in the questionnaire has been influenced, like it or not. It started to inculcate a certain view about wind farms, about energy, onshore wind energy. And so it's very hard to actually not be influenced. Now, we could call it bias, but we could also say that's part of the development of the research understanding and how it might influence how that deliberation then takes place. So we could see that as kind of being a benefit of linking the two in that way. And I just wonder whether, in fact, that we should separate the analyses, or integrate those analyses.
Or just do them with care and being aware of where those uncertainties might creep in. And I wanted to bring back the point of the sample size. At the beginning in the introduction, I mentioned some of the issues of the sampling for the citizens' juries, that they're quite small groups of people. We're looking between 15 and 18 people. So when you come to take survey results, these 4 panel surveys that we did during the citizens' jury process, what you can say mathematically or statistically about 18 different responses in 4 different surveys is actually quite difficult. If you then aggregate the 3 juries together, we have 54 different participants. You can say something a bit more meaningful, but still there was a real challenge that was not expected, trying to find statistical meaning from the survey data. And actually, the qualitative principles that were generated, they were at least very robust in terms of having a majority consensus on it. There wasn't any issues of trying to work out whether the change was meaningful, or how much more significant the people who were pro wind farms or saw positive benefits versus negative benefits were. And it caused a bit of problem for some time, and actually some really significant learning for future analyses, because I think what we hoped we could do with the data, we couldn't do as much because the sample size was so small.
Very interesting, though, the way opinions shifted in the way it did today, that there was a change. And one of the questions as a political scientist is what causes the change? Is it the information phase? Is it the reflection in the middle? Is it the deliberative phase? And our evidence, based purely on the surveys, would suggest that it's the information phase rather than the deliberative phase. Whereas you might have thought at the beginning it's deliberation which will really change people's views, because you have to defend positions, argue about it and come to some agreement, or agreement to differ if necessary. But it wasn't the case, and actually a lot of other research suggests it's the information phase. But the more we thought about it, deliberation and information don't occur in isolation from each other. And the fact that the jurors knew they were coming back to a second day to defend certain positions probably means they've deliberated quite a lot about what their position should be that they're going to defend. And so to say it was information, I suspect, is simplistic. So I think there would have been a danger, just looking at the survey analysis, to say it was about information, it wasn't about deliberation. But because we had this embedded in a citizens' jury, we could actually say it was a bit more nuanced than that, and probably involved both aspects of the process. We can't say definitively that's what happened, but it does suggest another way of looking at this data to interpret it.
And you can have a think about that yourselves as well, about how you think your opinions changed during the deliberation, and whether that was more significant than this information phase.
One of the things which I found fascinating, perhaps because I come from a political background, is how people who thought they weren't interested in politics at all, because remember this is a random sample, as random as we could make it, of general population, actually not knowing they're going to be talking about wind farms. They just knew it's something to do with environmental issues, because we didn't want them to come pre-armed with all sorts of views. And what emerged out of the end of it was, I never knew this kind of political work could be so much fun. I'm engaging with my neighbours, in the town or whatever, and I'm discovering that we've got a lot to talk about, and these issues are important, and even if we don't agree with each other, we are listening to each other, and we come to some considered views. I think that's one of the findings we find generally with citizens' juries. Even if your viewpoint is not the one that carries the day, people are much more accepting of it because they feel as though they have been heard and have been part of that process. But obviously you have to make sure you facilitate these groups to make sure that actually happens, and make sure the silent people have a say, the dominant people don't dominate, and so on, which is a tricky task. I mean, not for us today, but it can be very tricky.
Those are really quite long-term benefits that you're putting into the public that participate. These long-term building of what we call self-efficacy, so this confidence that they have a voice, that they can participate. Most of the jurors said that they would participate in a process again. In fact, many of them really wanted to participate. They'd say at the final comment, when's the next one? And that's quite unusual for many public forums to really wish to participate in another 2-hour debate about a community matter. So that was quite interesting about what else you're bringing to people by doing this process. And I think that's why they say things like mini publics or citizens' juries create this longer term engagement, because what you're doing is creating this, you're investing time, but you're getting this kind of movement of people that are suddenly very interested and quite informed about the issue and quite willing to engage on other topics because they've realised their own capacity to do so.
I think it was really brought home to me, just as a final comment on that, was a woman who was fairly elderly, who had never been in any environment like this where this public kind of issue was discussed. And she said, I just wish I had known that I could have done this earlier in my life. And actually she died shortly afterwards, didn't she?
Yeah, she did.
And I'm just thinking, great, we gave her that opportunity.
Yeah.
So I think there are some incredible benefits to open this up for people. Any questions you've got to either of us?
Yes. Did you start with quantitative and then qualitative, or you did them at the same time?
Well, they're integrated really. So the quantitative part was very much based on the surveys, and there were 4 of these. One at the beginning of the first day, at the end of the first day, beginning of the second day, end of the second day. And I suppose you might argue that citizens' jury is a kind of qualitative process in which these surveys were embedded. We designed it to integrate the quantitative in the qual.
Because there was ethnography, like observation throughout the whole process as well, including during the surveys. And the surveys were not just purely quantitative data, there was a lot of qualitative data generated. And I think one of the things we didn't pick up in our conversation, but it's also interesting to consider how much the questions in the surveys would have affected how people then thought about the topic. You did touch on the fact that you really can't pull apart information and deliberation, because the surveys themselves, the questions in the questionnaire that you did this morning, might have got you thinking about what to bring up in the deliberation. So they definitely were not, the methods were not distinct at all from each other, and they were not one then the other. It was an entirely integrated process. It was simply the data analysis were, for some parts, done quite separately.
All right, because I'm actually intending to use mixed methods in my data collection. Yeah, so it's quite useful.